Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some massive trade news involving the San Jose Sharks, and that is that, yes, indeed, they have picked up goaltending prospect Yaroslav Askarov from the Nashville Predators, along with a third-round pick and forward prospect Nolan Burke, in exchange for the first-round pick belonging to the Vegas Golden Knights, forward prospect David Edstrom, and goaltending prospect Magnus Chrona. Now, immediately on the surface, this seems like a pretty big win for the San Jose Sharks and for Mike Grier. The fact that they were able to pick up such a highly touted goaltending prospect, one of the most, if not the most, in the entire league, and they really didn't have to break the bank all that much to accomplish this goal, is a huge boost to the San Jose Sharks rebuild. Now, of course, there are no guarantees when it comes to NHL prospects, and even less so when it comes to NHL goaltending prospects, but if Askarov is able to follow in the footsteps of some previous Russian goaltending prospects like Ilya Sorokin of the New York Islanders or Igor Shesterkin of the New York Rangers, that would be so big for the San Jose Sharks as we move forward in their ongoing rebuild. Now, it was just yesterday where I made a video discussing whether or not the San Jose Sharks should be involved in the Yaroslav Askarov sweepstakes, and as a conclusion I said a resounding yes, and not only should the Sharks be involved, but they should try to make themselves the front runner of such a trade because of how big of a pickup it would actually be for the organization. And in less than 24 hours, Mike Grier has managed to make it happen. I also, in that video, discussed potential centerpieces of a return for Askarov. I talked about Quentin Musty as a prospect. I talked about roster players Fabian Zetterlund and Mario Ferraro. And I also, near the end of it, mentioned the Vegas Golden Knights first rounder that the Sharks were in possession of. And it seems as though Mike Grier and Barry Trotz agreed to make that the centerpiece of this trade. But before I get to talking about that asset, there are a few other pieces involved here besides Askarov and that first. So first of all, besides Askarov, the Sharks also pick up forward prospect Nolan Burke. Now, he's not really anything to write home about, nothing particularly special here about him, no offense. This seems more so a move that is made to make the contract situation work. The Sharks give up two signed players when it comes to Edstrom and when it comes to Magnus Chrona, and so the Predators want to do the very same thing with Askarov and with Burke. Burke is an undrafted player, not particularly impressive numbers when it comes to his time in the ECHL, so I doubt he really ever becomes anything at the NHL level. The other asset picked up here is a third-round pick belonging to the Colorado Avalanche, so it is likely to be late in the third round, but still a very nice asset to have actually acquired in addition to Askarov. Now, what the Sharks actually gave up, we start off with goaltending prospect Magnus Chrona, though I use the word prospect relatively lightly because in comparison to Askarov, they are not even in the same universe. Askarov projects as a solid, if not really good starter in the NHL, while Magnus Chrona, who knows if he will even project as an NHL backup. Really, this swap ends up getting done because of the fact that Askarov had been penciled in to be the starter for the Milwaukee Admirals, and with his absence, the Predators needed to fill that void. Chrona was supposed to be the starter for the San Jose Barracuda, and so this swap sort of works out in that regard, but obviously it is a massive upgrade from a San Jose Sharks perspective. The next asset is forward prospect David Edstrom. This is a loss for the San Jose Sharks, don't get me wrong. Edstrom projected out as a solid enough third-line center where if everything really truly fell into place for him, he could be a second-line center in the NHL. But if you compare to the rest of the forward depth charts that the San Jose Sharks do have, it is not something that's going to be leaving a massive hole there. He was squarely behind the likes of Celebrini, Smith, and Quentin Musty, obviously, but even in that next tier of prospects, one could argue he was behind players like Bistet, Chernyshov, Haltunen, and depending on how you really view players like Graf and Bordeleau, if you view them as NHL prospects still, even though they have games under their belt, he may even be behind those two names. So while he may have been as high as like fifth best forward prospect, one could argue he was as low as like 9th or 10th best forward prospect as well. So indeed, not something that's really going to change the Sharks' forward prospect pool, their depth at that area. And when you also consider the fact that he wasn't natively drafted by the San Jose Sharks and was instead picked up in a trade by San Jose a few months ago in the Hurdle deal, it's also not something that's going to make a lot of San Jose Sharks fans too disappointed. The real asset of this trade is, of course, the first rounder. This is an asset that got a lot of people very excited. Yes, the Golden Knights are historically a pretty good team, but after this offseason where they lost both Jonathan Marchessault and Chandler Stevenson, some pretty big pieces of that team, many people started to believe that perhaps the Vegas Knights could end up crashing and burning going into next season, and perhaps even missing the playoffs, especially when you consider the fact that they only just barely made it to the playoffs this past year. And so, with it being unprotected, the fact is that the Sharks could have ended up with a top 15, a top 10, perhaps even better than that if the Golden Knights were to win the lottery or really truly have a terrible season and find themselves, let's say, in the top 5. There were definitely a lot of hopes there. However, it is important to note that the Golden Knights are only a couple of years removed from a Stanley Cup championship, and the roster really hasn't undergone that much roster turnover since then. Sure, Marchessault is gone, but he's not the first longtime Vegas Golden Knights to leave that organization. And with the full-time seasons of both Tomas Hertl and Noah Hanifin helping them out this upcoming season, it is still very possible for the Golden Knights to make the playoffs just as they did this past season, especially when you also consider the fact that they are still in a pretty weak Pacific division. Yes, there's the big names of the Oilers, the Canucks, and the Kings. They were the 3 best teams in the Pacific last year, and they may very well manage to repeat that. But the other names in that division, San Jose, Anaheim, Calgary, likely to be bottom feeders for this upcoming season. No offense to San Jose, but we are kind of in agreement that that is likely to be the case. Seattle maybe more so middle of the pack, but they're not necessarily that impressive on paper. And so the Golden Knights shouldn't have that much trouble actually being able to get to the postseason, at which point this first rounder ends up being in the late teens, perhaps even in the mid-20s, depending on how the Golden Knights actually end up doing. And this is not all that big of a loss for San Jose. Giving up a former 32nd overall pick as well as a late first rounder for a goaltending prospect as high potential as Askarov is such a massive win on paper for the San Jose Sharks that I would do that trade every single day of the week. Even in the somewhat unlikely situation, though possible, that the Golden Knights do indeed miss the playoffs and this pick ends up being something like 14th overall or something along those lines, it's still not really the end of the world for the San Jose Sharks, especially when you also consider the fact that Mike Grier has actually put in a bit of a fail-safe on this particular pick. There is a condition on this first rounder, which is that if the Golden Knights pick ends up being in the top 10 of the draft, the Sharks actually have the option of sending their own first rounder instead of that one belonging to Vegas. Now, what this accomplishes is that if, in the unlikely, very unlikely situation that the Golden Knights actually finish lower in the standings than the San Jose Sharks, the Sharks could send their own first rounder, but also in the slightly higher chance, if the Golden Knights were to actually win the draft lottery and move up either to first or second overall, or move up 10 slots to like third or fourth overall, and the Sharks who finish, let's say, fifth or sixth, end up finishing right there in that spot or even dropping a bit, the Sharks could instead send over that one. It's obviously not an optimal situation. You'd rather have 2 top 10 picks in that case, but the fact that they have the option to at least take the higher one if it does come to that is still a bit of a nice piece of conditioning that Mike Grier has put on that first rounder. So it should still end up looking quite good for the San Jose Sharks, even in the situation where the Golden Knights do completely collapse of an organization. But honestly, I have faith in them, considering that they have always been a really, really good team. And again, they're only a couple of years removed. We know how good Tomas Hertl can be in and on a really, really good team like the Golden Knights could be. So this should end up being a relatively late first rounder. What I also want to compare this trade to is the Tomas Hertl trade itself. You see, it was back near the trade deadline of last season where the Sharks traded Tomas Hertl as well as 2 third-round picks to the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for their unprotected first rounder and for David Edstrom. And now the Sharks are acquiring Askarov and a third-round pick in exchange for the Vegas Golden Knights first rounder and David Edstrom. And so technically, you could consider this trade as being Hertl and a third for Askarov. And the fact that you're getting rid of an aging player who is on a large contract that doesn't really fit into your future plans for an elite goaltending prospect, that's a big win in my books. That's the type of trade that really would put Mike Grier on the map there, going significantly younger, addressing a position that the San Jose Sharks absolutely need. And so even if you're looking at this and saying, well, that first rounder, it could have actually ended up being pretty good, if you do look at it in the case of Hertl and a third for Askarov, how could you really be all that upset about this deal being made? And so Mike Grier, it is another big win in his books. There have been some shaky moments this offseason with the acquisitions of, Barclay Goodrow, with the signing of Luke Cunnin, but I'd say it has mostly been rather positive for him. And I'm even more excited now going into this next season. I imagine the Sharks will likely look to either get rid of in a trade either Vanacek or Blackwood, or perhaps just waive one of these two goaltenders, because there's absolutely no way Askarov starts this season in the AHL, considering he specifically wanted to avoid doing that with Nashville. And so I'm excited to see what he's able to do with some consistent NHL action. This next season is going to be a fun one. Class dismissed.